All right, it's officially 10 o'clock, and I'm sure more people will jump on as we get going here, but thank you all for being here. We're so excited to have you for our very first webinar, Building Partnerships Across Borders, and our new series, Conservation, the Crown, and Coffee. Hopefully you are cozied up at home or in the office with a nice mug of coffee or tea. My name is Natalie Paremba. I am the Conservation's Priorities Coordinator and Secretariat for the Crown Managers Partnership. And today we're just going to go over some logistics before we get into our speakers. The first thing to note is that this session is being recorded so that you're aware. The second thing that we ask is to please mute your phone or your computer mic if you have not done so already. And also to please keep your video off unless you're speaking, and that will just help us with any bandwidth issues. In terms of the format of this webinar, we have 3 speakers with us here today, and they will each present for 10 to 15 minutes. And then at the end of the entire webinar, we'll have a Q&A that's around 15 to 20 minutes long. So throughout the presentations, feel free to put any comments or questions that you might have in the chat, and then we'll get to those at the final big Q&A session. But please note when you're typing in your questions, which speaker that question is directed to. What and who to expect in the next hour. All 3 of our speakers are steering committee members with the Crown Managers Partnership. The first speaker is Len Broberg, and he is with the University of Montana. And Len has been with the Crown Managers Partnership since we began in 2001. So he's just going to talk about some lessons that we've learned throughout our existence. And our second speaker is Chad Willms, who's with Alberta Environment and Parks. And Chad is going to give a manager's perspective on why it would be valuable to be a part of a transboundary partnership. And finally, we have Erin Sexton, who is the CMP Science Director with the Flathead Lake Biological Station. And she is going to talk about decision-making in large landscape partnerships and sort of where we're personally headed in the future. So without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand it over to Len.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural webinar. We're excited to see you all here. As Natalie said, I'm Len Broberg. I'm with the University of Montana in the Environmental Studies program, and I've been on the steering committee of the Crown Managers Partnership soon after its formation, within a year, which now makes me the longest serving member, incredibly to me, on the steering committee. And so it falls to me then to kind of give you a historical perspective on CMP and kind of what we've learned in the process of doing the work of the CMP. So let me get my PowerPoint up here. All right, is everybody seeing the PowerPoint? Okay, so my talk, as Natalie suggested, is about the Crown Managers Partnership experience and just picking out some of the lessons we've learned. I'm not going to cover everything we've learned, which is really quite a bit, but it's been a very fascinating journey for me to be part of, and have enjoyed it. And I think we've learned some definite lessons that could be shared more broadly across attempts to do this kind of work across jurisdictions, across international and political boundaries. For those of you that might not be as familiar with what the CMP is, to get us oriented, basically the CMP is made up of managers of provincial, state, federal, and tribal First Nation lands in the crown of the continent, plus universities in the sense of being part of the steering committee and lending support, and then other partners also contribute to the work that we do. The mission of the CMP is to support the management of highly valued ecological systems across complex jurisdictional boundaries in this crown of the continent. And the main work that we do is building awareness of ecological issues, sharing information and best practices, and identifying collaborative and complementary actions, and doing that across a wide variety of jurisdictions. A guidepost, I think, of all of the work of the CMP over all the years that I've been involved is ecological integrity. And so we've worked from many perspectives and many kind of management positions and outside of management as well to work towards ecological integrity. And for those of you that might need a refresher or an orientation to this, here's a map of the crown of the continent, stretching along the spine of the Rockies here from north of Missoula up to southwest of Calgary, the High River area on the Alberta side, and up past the Fording River, et cetera, in British Columbia. And so it includes a number of communities within the region, but also a large patch of wildlands at its core. So where did the CMP start? It was founded in 2001 in a meeting convened by the two parks that make up the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. So Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada and Glacier National Park. And they invited managers from around Alberta, British Columbia, and Montana to get together and have a discussion about how can we look at managing in a more coordinated way across this broader landscape, and thinking about what that might mean and sharing ideas and information in a way that would assist that kind of goal. And over the time from its formation to now, we've had at least 33 different steering committee members. It was kind of a fun project to go back and think of everybody. I think we have about 19 people listed on the website right now, but the core steering committee is made up of a somewhat smaller subset of that, but it nonetheless has been a group that has evolved over time and changed, and that's one of the lessons learned that I'll share with you later. And basically, the Crown Managers Partnership has delivered many projects, fomented several coordinated management efforts, things like working on aquatic invasives, things like the five-needle pine work, things like native trout restoration, et cetera. And Erin will probably get into these in much more detail.
Can we just now use that?
And it also offered a platform for cross-boundary communication and understanding, which is not a trivial project. That sounds like, well, you know, everybody knows what everybody's going on, but really to have a chance to sit down and talk about it and learn and understand better, and then try and craft a way through that met shared objectives has really been part of the exploration and work of the Crown Managers Partnership. So I'm going to share with you now some lessons that we've learned, I think, in the course of the work. And these are my take on what we have experienced and gained in terms of knowledge and understanding of how to do this work. And I'm sure there's others that have other lessons to add, and this is not a exhaustive list that I've put together, but just some highlights. So one lesson we learned early on was actually in reconciling the different language that's used in various jurisdictions across the crown of the continent. So early on, we had a project that was dubbed the cumulative effects analysis. And this was an attempt to really use a short term to describe the process of trying to assemble a comprehensive picture of what the status of resources and activities and experiences were across the entire crown of the continent region, and then project perhaps where we were going if we kept going on the same path. And there were lots of different probes that happened in this process, but one thing was that we put this name process and did so. I think my understanding is in Canada, this is a very common term to refer to kind of comprehensive environmental assessment. In other words, not necessarily for a formal legal process, but for understanding where you are and what might happen in the future. But of course, in the United States, this term is connected very strongly to the obligations under the National Environmental Policy Act. And that connection made some partners in the United States very uncomfortable with the process and worried that it might interfere with their own obligations and how they might carry them out into the future. And so we learned then that just those words were a stumbling block to moving forward together. And so at that point, we rebranded it as the Ecological Health Project. And this process of putting together Crown data and assembling it and looking at where we are and where we might go has continued to date in various forms and under various names since. But we learned in this process that you have to be careful about what words you use to describe what you're about and what you're doing. A second lesson is very much to be flexible and adaptive and seizing opportunities when they appear. This project started as something that was kind of on the edge of people's desks, if not completely off to the side on a chair in terms of their work obligations. But folks were really interested in what was the potential of doing this work. And everyone, I think, shares a perception that their patch of ground, wherever it might be, is not isolated, and what happens on adjoining and even somewhat remote patches can have an effect on their ability to meet their mission and preserve ecological integrity successfully, as well as the communities, human communities within the ecosystem. And so, I think this led to a kind of spirit of being opportunistic, and that's happened with funding, where we've gone through transitions of funding and major funders. Just one example is the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative. The GNLCC was a major funder for several years here in the past. With the transition in leadership in the United States, that process has morphed and faded, and the money attached to it has changed, and so we've had to switch to other funding. Projects have arisen, sometimes generated within the CMP, but oftentimes generated outside. And then also being open to other partners, maybe non-traditional partners, that have allowed us to expand our resource base and to get the work done in a more effective way. So working with the nonprofit community, working with industry, whatever the case might be. Lesson 3 is clarity about mission and goals will attract people with a productive mindset. I've always been struck over the time that I've been with the CMP, how focused and kind of effective in terms of their thought process and just how to put things together this group has been. And part of that has to be attracting the right people to the table. And I think the theme of ecological integrity has been a part of that, would be my guess, if you will. And then application is the focus. We're really looking at doing things that are meaningful to people in accomplishing their work and hewing to this idea of ecological integrity as it may be styled in various jurisdictions. And so I think that has really combined to lead us to be very lucky to have an outstanding group of people. And I think also forcing ourselves to do a 5-year plan and evaluating, assessing where we were there, and you're seeing the current one there. We're soon to release a new one to move into the next decade. And I think that helps us stay grounded and also clear about what we're doing. And gives us a chance to clarify it as new people come and go as well, bring them up to speed, bring them on board, and also gain their insights that are new and allow this process to evolve. Another important feature has been planning for succession. As I said, I'm out of, I don't know what, there were certainly more than a dozen people at the start, or 10 to a dozen people at the start. I was brought in because I was doing work across the U.S.-Canadian border, had a partner, and Dr. Michael Quinn out of, at that time, the University of Calgary, and we're doing a joint graduate education program and bringing those resources to the table of graduate students, their need for project work, their interest in doing applied work that's meaningful, and then the needs of the CMP were a good fit. But to my observation, the originators and some of their successors now have carefully recruited and integrated successors into the steering committee. The next lesson is probably pretty obvious, but being mindful of varying missions, directives, and objectives of the members of the management community. So I've been struck as well over my time here in the CMP with how thoughtful and open people are to hearing, what is the needs of various jurisdictions. And we have a lot of different potential uses that are either permitted or in some cases required across the jurisdictions that have to be harmonized in some way, shape, or fashion. And I've been struck by the way that people are open to hearing how that works in other places and what that might look like if we were to put it all together. Lesson 6 is to gain political buy-in when possible. What I should have put on the slide here as well is patience and persistence. This slide shows a memorandum of understanding that was between the state of Montana, United States, and the government of the province of Alberta, Canada, about the Crown Managers Partnership. This was a major step forward, but this didn't happen quickly. This happened over several years due to hard work of Ian Dyson and others in Alberta, and then a number of people on the US side as well in Montana. And this has proven to be important in terms of leveraging continued support and funding, even in times of budget uncertainty. But we also have tried to get the federal government in the United States to participate more strongly with a memorandum, and that has had some ebbs and flows, and we have failed to get that done yet, but with patience and persistence, at some point, I think it'll come through. And then finally, I have been struck over time by just the spirit of collegiality and the opportunities to have fun. We all go to meetings, lots of meetings, and I have to say the Crown Managers Partnership, those meetings have consistently been the most stimulating and fun of meetings I've had across my career. And I think that's really important to get people to buy in. So if you peer closely at the slide, you'll see almost everybody smiling in the room. I don't know what's driving that, I don't remember, but it's not an unusual sight in these meetings. So get out of your trash monkey cave here and have fun with the CMP would be my final message. The look on that monkey's face says it all, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Len. And as I mentioned, for those who might have just hopped on later on, we're doing questions at the end of all speakers' presentations, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end. Thank you so much, Len. Next up, we have Chad Willms.
All right, thanks. Just to pull up my slideshow here. I think you should see that now, hey? You can hear me all right? Yeah, great, thanks. So yeah, I guess maybe I should give a bit of context to start, just as to why I'm one of the presenters. I mean, when the steering committee was talking about setting up this webinar, they of course wanted to have a perspective of one of the long-serving steering committee members. So of course everybody looked at Len, and then people were thinking, well, we should also have somebody that's new to the steering committee. And then somebody else piped in, oh, we should also have a Canadian. So I'm often sort of the token Canadian, I find, with the within the steering committee. There's a few of us from Canada on the steering committee, but these days it's much more heavily weighted on the US side, which is totally fine. I don't mind being the token Canadian, but I joined the steering committee just over a year ago, so I am for sure brand new at this work, but I'm here to give you a bit of an overview today of, I guess, the crown of the continent in its overlap within Alberta, and a bit of an overview of land use planning in the province here. And I've also, this presentation is also known as the story of why would you actually want to do that? So I love Dilbert. Thought I'd start with a Dilbert cartoon for you guys. So this is the one where Wally's considering getting into planning. So he says, I'm thinking of getting into the land use planning game. If I understand the job description, you basically hallucinate about the future, then something different happens. You also have to pretend it's useful. Really? That sounds hard. You know, they nailed it pretty good here, I think. I'm not quite sure about hallucinating about the future necessarily, but you know, we are kind of gazing into crystal ball sometimes, trying to anticipate what the future is going to look like, but then more so, trying to find a useful way to figure out what we want the future to actually be created to look like. And for sure, it is extremely hard. So planning is a way to achieve, you know, that direction and to try to get to that final outcome. So you set up with a good plan and you know where you want to get to, but you know that of course it's not always going to go as planned. So you create some contingency plans, you know, your plan B, in case there's any barriers or changes in direction that might arise. But of course, real life is always different than what you anticipate. And the path to get to your final outcome is always way more complicated than what you're anticipating. I think everybody's heard about policy development. You know, we use policies to help set some direction, which is for sure useful in the development of plans. But, you know, as they say, making a policy is like making sausages. You just really don't want to know what goes into it. Well, if policies are like making sausage, then I've come to start thinking about planning, land use planning, as being like making sandwiches. So let me explain. So there's obviously all kinds of different sandwiches out there that can be made in an infinite variety of ways. So as a group here, everybody that's on the phone, you know, think about what is your vision of what the best possible sandwich is that you would love to eat for lunch today. You know, think about it just for a moment. So some of you be looking at this picture and thinking, man, that's the one that I want to eat. Fully loaded with different types of meat, cheese, vegetables, a bunch of different sauces. Others of you, you know, you'll just want a peanut butter and jam sandwich. There's going to be a small group of you. You're going to band together. You're going to start to lobby me for bacon. Sandwiches got to have bacon. There's going to be another group of you that are going to push back and wanting something vegan. So in the end, no matter how I make the sandwich for all of us to eat, it's got to be a single sandwich. Some of you are going to be angry with me. There's going to be infighting amongst you to try to get your way for how the sandwich is going to be made. There's going to be a whole lot of frustration with the whole sandwich making process. There really is no easy solution on how to make a sandwich that will satisfy all of us. It's so complicated, just like land use planning. So gets to my first question now, like why would you want to do that? So let's go back to the picture from my title slide. So this is a shot of southern Alberta in the what we call the eastern slopes. It's the eastern facing slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So this is a picture that was actually taken within the Crown of the Continent area in southern Alberta. So this picture shows an area that's being used and respected by First Nations since time immemorial. This land had homesteaders settle on it back in the 1800s who are settling the West, and many of whom still have families that are ranching on these lands today. This picture, you know, for sure also contains within that frame, there's going to be native trout in there, there's grizzly bears, there's elk, there's mountain goats, bighorn sheep, there's five-needle pine, there's rough fescue, there's all kinds of like really valued species and communities. But this is also an area with lots of recreational demand. It's beautiful down there, so lots of people want to go out and recreate down there. There's tourism potential. There's also valuable natural resources, including forestry, coal, oil, and gas. It's a really complicated area, but you know, when you look at landscapes like this and all the values that are in it, you know, I feel that the effort to create plans for it is well worth it. So sometimes I feel my life is actually like a Dilbert cartoon. So in this one, the boss comes in and he says, let's have a little pre-meeting to prepare for the meeting tomorrow. Whoa, do you think it's safe to jump right into the pre-meeting without planning it? Okay, let's get this preliminary pre-meeting meeting going. You know, it's sometimes the truth in the work that we do. So before we undertake planning, we have to start with all the preliminary work to gather information. And we have so much data about the landscapes that we're planning for. Just a few examples here. So here's a shot of a map of southern Alberta. The western portion here in the purple, and this area over here, purple, and into the sort of yellow color here, this is the crown area. So this is primarily the mountain montane area, but also includes the fescue grasslands. We also have information here about biodiversity values. So this is a map that was created for a regional planning exercise we did quite a few years ago. So this is showing like higher valued areas for biodiversity, but this is also then showing corridors and connectivity across the landscape. The blue and the yellow and the red arrows. Interestingly, you can see that as this map was developed, it was quite internal looking. We were looking at connectivity within the planning area, and there's very few connections that are leading outside of a planning area. There's a few, but they're limited. Here's a map showing human footprint. This is an immense exercise to pull together like many different data sets to look at the different types of human footprint that we have on the landscape. So here's a map showing where there's a footprint from agriculture, forest harvesting, mining, other energy activities, transportation, urban development, etc. So the white areas show the part of the landscape that don't have human footprint. Fortunately, you see a lot of that white within the crown area, but you can also notice there's still a lot of activity within that area. So we have lots of data, lots of information. I mean, we also have just a lot of other information around social needs, about the economy, about the environment, about wildfire, about energy production, transportation, jobs, industry, agriculture, etc. So in all of our preliminary work, we try to bring all this information together, but then we start to get into the sandwich making. You have to look through all that data and information and try to figure out how to create a balance between multiple interests and outcomes. So in the public lands context, which is what I work within, I don't deal so much with parks and protected areas, but my work is more focused on planning for provincial public lands. You know, there's a lot of competing interests. So we must weigh the values and impacts of one of these against the other, which includes, you know, looking at recreation values and experiences on the landscape, biodiversity, water quality, water quantity, Indigenous perspectives in use, species at risk, neighboring landowners and uses, and tourism and economic impacts and industrial uses and scenic values and connectivity, of course. So again, it's complicated. And there's a lot of competing interests for that that we need to take into account in land use planning. So within the province, one of the priority areas that we started to undertake sub-regional planning at is actually within the Crown area. So once you get into sub-regional planning, that's a scale that we're using within the province here. We can actually start to have more tangible trade-off discussions at the ground level. So this is in southern Alberta. On this map here, this side blue line is the border with BC, and the southern edge here is Montana. So what we have here is the yellow and the black blowing up on the right side of the screen here. This is the Livingston and Porcupine Hills area, right smack dab within the Crown area within Alberta at least. These are public lands, and we undertook land use planning at the sub-regional scale here, you know, a handful of years ago. So some additional context, the green here then is Castle Parks. So this is a newly established provincial park just to the south of Livingston, and to the south of that is Waterton National Park. We also have green to the north of Livingston, which are other provincial parks, and further north of that, national parks. So this is a really high valued landscape, which is why this is one of the priority areas within the province to start undertaking sub-regional planning. This area has high levels of biodiversity. This area also forms the headwaters for southern Alberta's drinking water. So we start to look at the values in there, and we start to pull together the data. In this area, we pull together you know, information about species at risk, about wildlife corridors, critical habitat, water quality, watershed integrity, habitat quality, quantity, soils suitability, and erosion risk. A whole bunch of other factors went into it, and we've started in recent years using MarkSand quite heavily to help support planning, particularly at that sub-regional scale. So this is one of the outputs from one of the MarkSand runs. So what this does is identify areas, optimized areas of higher environmental or biodiversity value. But then it comes, weighs into it within the model, the costs and constraints on the landscape. So we use that model and we use additional information. We use a bunch of scientific literature to look at, tolerances of different species to different types of use. In this area, there's fairly heavy footprint from both industrial activities, but then also from motorized recreation. So we take all this information, crunch it together, look at what individual species need, what's known about their tolerances to different other land use activities. It becomes pretty complicated. We work with a lot of internal subject matter experts to review the work that we're doing to make sure we're moving in the right direction. But then we also have to take that out and talk to stakeholders, First Nations, and the public. We get challenged all the time about whether the data layers are correct, around are these numbers and the tolerances correct. People put other science in front of us and say that we're not putting in the right information. It becomes a very complicated process. Where we're trying to balance both the information going in, but then even more so, the information that comes out, which then becomes a balance for how we're trying to support multiple land use activities on the landscape. In the end, in this area, we used a zonation approach. Alberta is moving into a outcomes-based management system. So we are looking at cumulative effects of all activities on the landscape. And what we came up with was a footprint plan. We're recognizing that human footprint is one of the leading drivers that affects biodiversity and also watershed integrity. So we set up a system to manage for different levels of footprint on different parts of the planning area, which then we use to set motorized access density limits. So this is directed both at industrial access, so industry roads to access cut blocks and well sites and other industrial activities, but it's also directed at recreational motorized activity. So recognizing that, particularly ATVs or off-highway vehicles, which is this is a very popular spot for OHV activity. We also have a system set up where we manage for the overall density of motorized recreation within the area. The plan also directs better collaboration with all land users, improved coordination between industries, and we're also recognizing First Nations use history of the area. So from our jurisdictional scan, we've found that we're actually the first jurisdiction in North America, as we know, that have actually set regulatory limits on motorized access within a planning area. We're continually being challenged by the limits that we set within this area, but so far, we are operating and managing the landscape to be within the thresholds that we created within regulation. So it's a big step forward for us. It was first certainly a precedent setting, and it's leading to a lot of continued work within the area, but it's really improved already how we're managing the landscape. So here's the Crown jurisdictions. So the Livingston, I guess first just to orient you, this is the border between Alberta and BC, and this is between Canada and the US. So Montana, of course, to the south here. So within Alberta, we have in this pinkish colored area, we have the Livingston that I was just talking about, Porcupine Hills over here. We have private land in the blue over here. The green here is the Castle Parks, the blue here is Waterton National Park. So we're actually really good. We've become pretty good at developing land use plans at that sub-regional scale. But we're also really good just as people, as humans, in compartmentalizing the landscape. You can see here that within the Crown area, we've created all these compartments of different land use, different land managers, different jurisdictions. And, you know, we all have our place within the landscape, but we've created all these compartments within which that we work and manage the land on. But if you remove that layer and you just like look at this map, even at this scale, you can actually see that it is actually a fully interconnected landscape, regardless of how we draw our political and jurisdictional lines. In this area, we have wide-ranging species and processes. We have grizzly bears and ungulates that utilize this whole range, or they're crossing borders, and they're not seeing the compartments that we've drawn lines on the map for. So you can see all the way through. You've got the spine of the Rockies coming down. You have this montane and rough fescue and grasslands across the whole region. So it comes down to then, you know, we're all busy. All of us as land managers, no matter which jurisdiction, which parcel of land you're working in, we're all busy with our jobs. So why would you want to join the Crown Managers Partnership? There's a few reasons. And so we're all dealing with similar issues, whether you're in Alberta, BC, Montana, we have a lot of the same issues that we're trying to manage for. So there's huge learnings that we can have by working together on initiatives and coming together to share experiences and information and to learn from one another. A few of the really tangible projects that CMP has been working on in recent years that has had a direct connection to the province here is around native salmonids. We're dealing with West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout recovery along the eastern slopes within the province right now. There's been a native salmonids working group, which has provided a lot of really useful information to our fisheries biologists in the province. There's been a five-needle pine working group, the High Five group. So this is looking at limber and whitebark pine, both of which reside within Alberta. Again, great learnings, great experiences to share with our land manager partners and within the other jurisdictions. Last one I want to highlight is the landscape conservation design, which is a work that's being undertaken by the CMP right now, which I'm involved in, which is again using mark sand modeling. We're looking at the whole Crown landscape, and I'm really excited about this project because I think this is going to lead to some really interesting outcomes that will be applicable within Alberta for future land use planning. When you run mark sand models, your outputs for sure change depending on the scale that you're looking at. So it's going to be really interesting to see how planning units that we've worked on, such as Livingston Porcupine Hills, you know, come out within this larger, broader landscape analysis within this project. Additionally, you know, I believe that by all of us coming together from multiple jurisdictions, you know, we're all dealing with every 4 years, changing governments, changing priorities, changing budgets. And I feel that by the group of us coming together, it actually creates resilience within the system. You know, when some of us might be struggling with, you know, current policies and budgets, others may not be as challenged in the same way. So I feel that by all of us working together, working for that common outcome across the whole Crown area, we're actually building resilience into the land management system as a whole. You know, the collaboration with like-minded individuals is awesome, you know, which is what Len was talking about also. You know, day to day, we're dealing with like conflict and people that are not happy with their planning process, not happy with government. We're just like dealing with conflict all day long. And, you know, it's pretty awesome to come together with like-minded individuals and actually working towards, you know, a common objective. Again, also, planning is hard. The CMP really is a fun group to work with. And lastly, the sandwiches at the meetings are amazing. With that, thank you, and I'll take any questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Chad. I'm loving this retro photo that you had up of the Canadian US pick. Pretty good. Yeah, as Chad said, please direct any questions that you have in the chat box, and we will get to that after our final speaker, Erin Sexton, presents. So Erin, take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen and then start my presentation because I'm technologically challenged. Can you guys see that? And you can hear me, so we're good. Okay. Thanks to Chad and Lynn for giving us the background and history, and also sort of explaining why anybody would want to be a part of the Crown Managers Partnership. That's great. I'm gonna speak a little bit more about what we actually do. I'm a senior scientist at the University of Montana Flathead Lake Biological Station, and over the years I have come to play the role of the science director for the CMP. I'm actually an original Crown of the Continent groupie. I was a student in Len's class in 2001 as part of the Environmental Studies program, and actually attended the first meeting as a grad student. This is a picture of the report that came out of that workshop, which basically is, you know, an ecosystem management workshop, which is really the test that we came together to look at was, you know, do we want to work together at the scale of the Crown of the Continent? And the fact that we can present here to you today shows that that it's a successful test. And Len and I use the same picture because all of our other ones are actually just unhappy. So, but this is in Lethbridge, Alberta. It's the last time we were all together in person. So we've stood the test of time, but what have we actually been doing? So I'm going to bring up this jurisdictional complexity map again, but use it to speak to why we work together, and how we've turned the challenge of boundaries across the landscape into opportunities for working at the ecosystem scale. And so to put a finer point on that, if you're a grizzly bear in the Crown of the Continent ecosystem, you will be managed in your home territory by 2 federal governments, 2 provincial governments, and a state government. And depending on where you are at any given time, you may have very different management regimes governing you. So you could be hunted legally, you could be federally protected under the Endangered Species Act. And these, the status of a bear in the jurisdictions in these landscape has changed significantly over the last 20 years. So this right here is one great reason why we need to work together across the ecosystem. Also, we rely on our connectivity across this landscape to manage the species in this landscape. So this is the historic range of grizzly bears in light brown, present day drastically reduced range in darker brown. And obviously, if we want to keep our grizzly bears in the United States, we have to figure out how to keep our connectivity to Canada. This has always been one of the priorities of the Crown Managers Partnership. Grizzly bears rose to the top from the start. Likewise, this is the transboundary Flathead River. North of the border, it's called the Flathead. South of the border, it's the North Fork of the Flathead. That's Crown land north of the border. Glacier National Park over here, Flathead National Forest. So we are really good at carving up this landscape into different jurisdictions when clearly this river is connected, as are the West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout and other fish that use this river, regardless of what jurisdiction they're in. So this is just a summary. You guys have already heard about this, but basically based on, you know, those challenges of our borders and the opportunity to overcome them, we're really just working to collectively foster stewardship in the Crown of the Continent for ecological integrity, for our shared environmental resources. And so how do we do that? So in the early days, after establishing the partnership, deciding on how the table's formed and what people want to come together and talk about, that there's a commitment to be a partnership, the CMP started to get very specific about what their priorities were on the large landscape. And so the original iteration of this work is called the Ecological Health Project. It was more firmly articulated starting in 2008, but it's really just a large landscape indicators-based approach that became the multi-year strategic priority for the CMP. So every time the group gets together, all of our workshops, we have been focused on this large landscape indicators-based approach. And that initially through several workshops, convenings of stakeholders, agencies, private landowners, local governments. This is the initial list that we came up for our indicators of ecological health. And really sort of the filter that we run these through is what do the managers bring to the table as their top priorities? And then where, and I'll speak to this a little bit more, where is the science with respect to our knowledge of these priorities? And this is us today. So we've gotten a little more hip looking thanks to having people like Natalie working with us, but we really haven't changed our focus that much over the years. We have gotten more refined and we've started to frame things differently. But we're still working at these stressors and conservation priorities that resonate at the crown of the continent scale. And I'll come back to that a little bit more. And so the other thing I want to point out is that one of our principles for approaching this work is that we need landscape scale science to talk about these conservation priorities. So we needed to build data across the crown of the continent that was consistent and seamless. And so we weren't looking at apples and oranges with respect to, say, grizzly bear data, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So we started in 2009 to build a transboundary database for our conservation priorities that we could rely upon collectively to look at the scale of the crown. And so I have to, because this has been one of the things I've worked on deeply over the years with the crown. It's not easy to build transboundary data sets across the crown of the continent. And so we thought we'll build a roads layer. It took us about 3 years, I think I want to say. And so you can see here, everybody maps their roads differently. Everybody puts them into databases differently. And so you can see the state and provincial data sets, and the different colors are showing the different jurisdictions and how they don't match up. If you try to follow any one of those lines across the international boundary or across the jurisdictions, they don't connect. And so we put a lot of effort, and this is just roads. This is true for streams and for invasive species, for terrestrial invasive plants. Pretty much everything we've tried to work on looks like this when you first take a pass at creating a data set. But over time, and really with the strength of the partnership, you can create seamless data sets that are much easier to work with. And so this is our roads data layer after it's been refined, and this is a heat map of density. And so I just want to emphasize here that the partnership, the agencies are key to this. Data access is actually a really big challenge across the jurisdictions. Alberta used to be our biggest problem child, and then they sort of evolved to be much more freely sharing with their data. We overcame it at the CMP with a memoranda of understanding to across, again, relying on those relationships to say who can have access to the data, what can it be used for, what's the purpose of this joint data set, and so on and so forth. I just want to say that we are not the only game on the landscape. The crown of the continent has risen in profile greatly over the last decade and a half. And initiatives, some of them have been here before us, some have risen over our time scale on the landscape, and there's probably more to come into the future. And really our goal is just to be here, be established, know what our role is and what we're focused on, and be able to work with these initiatives as they come onto the landscape or evolve their priorities. And I think we've been able to do that really well over the years. And just to put a finer point on that, depending on the need in the landscape, sometimes the CMP will take the lead if there isn't anybody addressing an issue. For example, that was aquatic invasive species in the early days. Then we can move to more of a support role and just be a part of the partnership that's ongoing. And sometimes we just monitor what's going on. And this is just a little data on our collective impact over the years. We hold an annual forum every year. We've done 19 of those. We've had some fits and starts the last couple of years with government shutdowns and viruses. We currently have 4 active working groups, which I'll talk a little bit about, and we've had over 700 participants over the years. And our format for these workshops, we've also refined that over the years. And so we really focus on trying to bring the managers and the scientists, the practitioners and the decision makers into one room and talk about what's rising to the top and how we might address it. And it's very collaborative. And I think one thing to emphasize is that the CMP does not manage, the agencies do. So we collectively don't have any mandates on the landscape as the Crown Managers Partnership. We're really here to voluntarily, collaboratively problem solve and let the managers take that back. I want to point out that 2014 was a real important year for us. It's when the Crown Managers Partnership sort of embraced climate change adaptation as a very important process, or climate change as an important process on the landscape, and the need to sort of look at our current ecological indicators, hold them against the context of climate change, and see if they stood up, if they were still relevant, or how climate change changed that for us. The knowledge and science and data around climate change in the Crown of the Continent has gotten to a really robust place over the years. We have some amazing people working here with our agencies and NGOs. And so we held 4 days of workshops in 2014. And that is how we came to these current day stressors and priorities. These are the things that rose to the top through our conversations, like in the face of climate change, what do we want to focus on? And the one that's missing here is fire. So we got to update this, but fire is actually the forum that we will have up and coming. We were supposed to have it in 2019 and then in 2020. So we're hoping 2021 we'll get to have our fire forum. But this is where we ended up when we held things up to the lens of climate change. Just a brief, quick on our working groups. You can find all of this on our website and contact information for our leads on all of these initiatives. Aquatic invasive species has been a real success for the Crown Managers Partnership. It started with awareness in the Flathead Basin here. We were able to export learnings and strategies to the province of Alberta. They launched their program and really it's grown and taken a life of its own. And now other initiatives are leading the AIS work in the Crown and greater region. So the Upper Columbia Conservation Commission is legislated by the governor of Montana. It spans the Columbia Basin and works very closely with British Columbia and Alberta. And so now we are monitoring, we're engaged. Actually, we're engaged with the AIS work, but we're no longer taking a leadership role with this priority. Chad spoke to the native salmonids work. West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout are hugely critical, iconic species to us in the Crown of the Continent, very important culturally. So we have been working with our U.S. Geological Survey partners and others in the province of Alberta and British Columbia to create data-based, web-based tools that can be resources to our managers and our partners for the conservation of native salmonids in the Crown of the Continent. Likewise, I would have never known it, but I guess it's because I'm not a tree person. Like 5-needle pines are really important to a lot of people in the Crown of the Continent. There's a huge amount of capacity and motivation to recover our 5-needle pines. And so we have a really highly functioning High Five working group. They are actively working with a lot of capacity to develop a Crown-wide restoration strategy. And again, you can find the information for all this on our website. And Chad spoke to our landscape conservation design. And so I'm not going to go into that in great detail. It's the way, to me, the LCD is our modern day ecological health project. It's how we try to roll up all of our landscape scale indicators into one framework. We've made our tent as big as we possibly can so that everybody's at the table that wants to be. And we're trying to have a conversation at the landscape scale about, where our priorities are looking into the future. And I'm really glad Chad gave a primer on Mark Sand, so I didn't have to go into that in any kind of detail. But we're using Mark Sand for our landscape conservation design. And Sean Finn with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is one of our steering committee members, and he's really resident expert on landscape conservation designs. So I direct you to him for further information on that. And so this is my last slide. So if you're here and you're like, oh, I want the Crown Managers Partnership to take on this thing for us, or I want to be a part of the CMP. So this is our filter. Is it relevant at the scale of the large landscape? If it's something, if we're trying to save a little snail that might just live down south of Missoula somewhere, it might not be a great fit for the Crown Managers Partnership. But something that is relevant at our scale definitely is. Are there things that are rising to the radar of our management agencies across the Canada and US and the provinces and state or locally? Have other entities identified something as a priority? Does it come to us as, you guys, we would really like you to take this on? And then recently I did a presentation with Natalie and she said, you know, is it a good challenge? Because the CMP really likes to take on good challenges. So is it just a really good multi-jurisdictional challenge that needs a good partnership to take it on across boundaries? So that's sort of some of the filters that we put on our work. And I think with that, I'll end. I hope we aren't completely out of time for, oh, we have 4 minutes. That's great. So sorry for going a little bit long. And I'll just turn it over to Natalie to facilitate any questions that have come up.
Thanks so much, Erin. And thank you to all of our speakers. In terms of questions that we've gotten in the chat, there are currently none. But if you want to ask a question live right now, please feel free to speak up and ask any of our presenters. And maybe while you're formulating a question, if you have one, I'm going to throw up our contact information. Oh, we have a question from Cliff. Do you have any suggestions for successful interaction with tribes and First Nations?
I maybe will start that one, and Erin and Len may have additional thoughts, but I mean, I know it's a little bit different in how they're recognized and how they use the land in Canada than in the United States. But we still respect treaty rights within Canada. We have legislation that enables, the practice of treaty rights. But, outside of the whole legislative piece, legislative requirements, within Alberta and specifically within land use planning, my number one recommendation is to start conversations early and build trust. You can't go into a conversation with a community or with an elder or with a chief and council immediately with what you want to be doing on the landscape. You can't start conversations that way. It takes sometimes years of relationship building and just ongoing conversation about everything, big, broad conversations, and just a lot of listening also. It takes a lot of listening just to hear their concerns, their ideas, before you can actually get into discussing, at my end, land use planning. So it takes a lot of time, a lot of relationship building.
Anything to add to that?
I think that's good. We got one more question.
Awesome. I am having difficulty opening my chat. So Erin, do you want to read it out loud?
Yeah, so from Jonathan Putnam, has CMP used either the World Heritage designation or Biosphere Reserve designation in any way, perhaps as an additional way to convene partnerships? Have we used the designation? I think it's, it's at the core of our partnership, given that Waterton Glacier International Peace Park has been a very, I think Parks Canada and Waterton Park and Glacier National Park are sort of the core entities. They've always been here and they've always brought great capacity to the partnership. The Waterton Biosphere Reserve Association works with us in terms of our fiscal responsibility. So we have a very strong partnership with Waterton Biosphere Reserve Association. But as far as using it in convening partners, I think over the years, we have worked within the Biosphere Reserve to, expand that tent that we work within. I don't know, Len, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things where there's different perspectives.
Oh, Len, you got muted.
All right. This is one of those situations where it's different in the United States and in Canada. And the view of the biosphere reserve concept in Canada is, I think, more of a general acceptance. In the region of the Crown of the Continent, for a lot of years, I think maybe this is fading, but for a number of years, there was strong opposition in the Flathead region to anything having to do with the United Nations. And that became problematic in terms of using it explicitly as a concept to try and stitch things together across the boundary, because it just raised flags that were distracting and really weren't helpful and impeded work on the US side. So I think there was a hesitancy to actively embrace that concept as something to move forward across the entire Crown of the Continent. But certainly, I'm not remembering this. There's something tickling in my brain about work with the Biosphere Reserve Association and use of the Biosphere Reserve concept early in our days. But that, for purposes of communication and optics, I think has been problematic, unfortunately.
And it appears that we are at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock. So I'm going to start to close out the webinar, but please feel free to contact any one of us with any additional questions you might have. Here, our contact information is up on the screen. And thank you so much for joining us in our very first webinar. Very exciting, and we appreciate you spending your morning with us, and have a great rest of your Friday.